Welcome to Housing for Huntsvillians, the podcast, a podcast about one couple's quest to eliminate homelessness in Huntsville by August 2026.
All right, we got both recorded.
Hello.
Hi.
Today, we are joined by our first guest, Keith Overholt.
Yep.
CEO and president of the Downtown Rescue Mission.
That's right.
This is Huntsville's largest homeless shelter. Is that right?
Right.
Awesome. And can you tell me a little bit more about what Downtown Rescue Mission is and does?
Sure. So we were originally started in 1975. The founder, who just passed away a couple years ago, his son was in the hospital, and there was a guy that was coming down the hallways just visiting people, and he visited him and his son, and they got on the conversation of, hey, did you know there's homeless in Huntsville? And the guy, the founder's like, no, I've not seen any homeless. It's back in the 70s, and Huntsville was even smaller than, And so they started a friendship, and from that, they started serving some sandwiches out of the back of a car. And that's really how the mission got started. From there, they went and said, well, we need to find some kind of facility where these guys can come and stay. And so they rented a place and incorporated in 1975. And then we've had a couple locations. And then we, back in 2008, went to the current campus that we're at now. We have about 130,000 square feet of facilities. There's two big facilities there. We average about 278 men, women, and children a night that stay with us. And it's any kind of background. It's any very racially diverse. Doesn't matter what religion you are. Doesn't matter what creed, sect. It doesn't matter whatever. We will have you come and you can stay with us. Our philosophy is we don't want anybody dying on the street. And from there, we're religious based. So we also, when they come in, we're about sharing Jesus with them. And we have a 1-year program it's a volunteer program that they can sign up for. So we have really two divisions. We have an emergency shelter. Anybody comes in and out as they wish, and that's for both the men, the women, and children. And then we have another section of our program that really is program based, where it's a year-long program, and they go through everything from how to do a resume, and then, how to find a job, and then job readiness skills, and along with the Bible-based program that we have. So that's a little bit about what we do.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And you are a second-generation homeless shelter family.
I am.
I watched your interview with Tony Bai.
Mm-hmm.
It's a really great interview. His show it should have more viewers, I think. But yeah, so I really enjoyed the story that you told, and sorry to make you repeat it, but I thought it was really interesting about how you got into it.
Yeah, my dad originally was a Baptist minister up north. We're from Buffalo, New York originally, and there's not many Baptists up north, so it's 90% Catholic, and I went to school. There was maybe 1 or 2 kids in my high school that actually weren't Catholic along with me, and
my mom actually grew up Catholic in Ohio, and then converted to Southern Baptist later in life.
Yeah. Well, it was not that it was lonely. I had a lot of good friends that were Catholic, and but there is a little bit different belief system there. But so anyhow, my dad, he was about 20 years as a senior pastor, and then went into being the director of a mission, kind of fell into it. He was kind of working there as their program guy, part-time, and doing a church at the same time. And they lost their director, and they said, hey, we'd like you to be the interim. And then from there, he became their director, and that was the city mission in Buffalo. And so when I was about 16 years old, I had just gotten my driver's license, and I said, hey, I'm going to go down and visit my dad down at the mission and kind of surprise him and, go down and see, maybe he'll take me out for lunch or something, And so I get down there, and I should have known, being a mission director, he's like, hey, we have meals here. I'm not going to take you out. So we ate with the folks that were coming through the line. And how they used to do it in Buffalo is they would have their program and the staff eat first, and then they'd have the gentlemen that were in the emergency shelter come through after. And as we're sitting there, I said, wow, Dad, I know this guy that was in the line, and he had curly blonde hair and younger, but kind of dirty. I mean, he kind of looked like he needed to be at a rescue facility, but my dad's like, you don't know that guy because we lived in the suburbs of Buffalo. He says, you've not been around the mission much. And I said, no, I know that guy. And it ended up being Joe, a guy that I knew that was a couple years ahead of me in high school. We both played sports. And he said that he started just drinking a little bit on the weekends and then started smoking some marijuana. And then from there decided, he needed more than that and got into some hard drugs back then, and I think crack was his thing back then. It was in the mid 80s or so, and so he said that his family finally got sick and tired of it because he just was doing all those things under the roof, and finally he ended up stealing from them and doing some of those things that, when the addiction gets in you, sometimes you're doing things you shouldn't be doing. And so I talked to him for probably about a half an hour that day, and I never saw Joe again, but it changed my life forever because I said, if a guy like Joe comes from the same background as I did, could end up at a mission, we lived in nice suburbs, and he had all the opportunities that I had, and something just clicked with him that he went a different direction. And like I said, I never knew what happened to Joe, but all through the years I've said to my staff, that when I look over the whole group, I see some Joes out there, and that's always, it's kind of what's driven me through the years to, try to save a guy like Joe.
I thought that was really important. I feel like one of the things that differentiates how people think about homelessness is there's a certain amount of dehumanization that can happen where you think of these people not as people, or you think of these people as a different kind of person. And the reality is a lot of people are a lot closer to homelessness than they realize. Especially that I think it's difficult living in, the richest country on earth. I think it's difficult for people in the top half, especially, to imagine how precarious life is for people in the bottom half.
Yeah.
How few social safety nets we have in place, how wide the holes are in them. Poverty, the sheer number and complexity of poverty traps in the U.S. Once you lose your footing, you just keep sliding and sliding, and there's nowhere to end up except dead or in prison, homeless, these places. And so it's super important to recognize the precarity that so many of us face. And I was listening to a true crime podcast recently, and this woman was talking about she had to get away from her husband, and she went to her family and nobody would take her in. And she was shocked by that. And so I just wonder how many of us are sitting here safe thinking we're insulated from this, and when push comes to shove, you don't know.
Yeah.
So anyway, I appreciate that. I also wanted to talk to you just generally speaking about some myths that people believe about the homeless, again, like the homeless are like this different kind of being, that they, choose to be homeless, for example, or they don't want to work. I wonder if you could just address some of those misconceptions from your experience.
Yeah, just a comment about something you said there. I wrote an article a couple months ago for our newsletter, and I had some people really that last month or two before I wrote the article just said some hard things, and like you said, the perspective that they had, almost like people are dogs, that are in that situation. And it broke my heart because the folks that we help, they could be a cousin or a sister or brother or mom and dad, or, we have folks that are from age, babies all the way up to 80, 90 years old. And they're regular folks. A lot of the men and women that comes through the mission are my friends. In fact, the mission has hired a lot of the folks through the years that have become very successful. and have not turned back to, the ways that they were before. And to see that success, it's just amazing. But, if somebody hadn't given them a hand up, they may have been still in the same position they were before. I was in another city, and I had some policemen that were helping me. I worked at the Nashville Rescue Mission. I had some policemen that were helping me with some guys that were there. And the guy said, "Hey, listen, you feed and clothe these people. Of course they're going to come to you, and it's like they're dogs." And I said, "Wait a second, what are you talking about? These are people. Why do we talk about people that way?" So I'm always, that was kind of what my article was about. I take offense to that because, listen, we've had people in all different ranges from the rich to the poor to the middle class come to us. Educational wise, we had a surgeon that came through our mission. And what happened is when he was going through school, he started getting addicted to some drugs. The hours they put these guys through was amazing. So he was taking drugs to stay awake, and then drugs to go to sleep. And then he started his practice and doing the surgeries and all the things. Well, he had continued that. And so it ended up that he lost his license and things like that. So here's a guy that put in probably 8 to 10 years of education, at least, to become a surgeon, who's staying at a rescue mission. Now, you wouldn't think that, but that's, could that not be your neighbor or your friend? That's the kind of folks that we deal with. We've had engineers that have stayed with us. Doctor's degrees, master's degrees, MBAs. All types of folks have come through our mission. And, just to say, what kind of folks they are regular people. They are, and I'll just tell you this, my dad and I have done this for a while, and it's a calling for us. But my sister struggled with some homelessness for a while. And, here we have all the opportunities that she could come to, right? But she didn't. She just decided on her own. She's like, "Listen, I don't want to do what Dad and my brother are doing. I just want to do it on my own." So she slept in her car for a while, and and sometimes the folks, you want to help them so bad, but they don't want help themselves. And then there's some that want a lot of help. So there's a lot of things that range with that.
Absolutely, thank you. I also wanted to address the idea that people who find themselves unhoused should just move to cheaper areas. Like, have you heard that argument? I think it's definitely something I heard more in San Francisco, which was a very expensive area. Mm-hmm. But in terms of, in comparison to outlying areas, I think Huntsville is definitely getting a lot more expensive.
Yeah.
My understanding is, well, again, just because somebody is unhoused doesn't mean they shouldn't be able to live around their communities. And also, it's very useful to a person to be in connection with their community. Yeah. Right? None of us gets better on our own. But I just wondered if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, a survey, or I don't know if it was a survey or not, but I've had some of my staff come back and say all the apartments they're building right now, base price is $1,500 a month.
Right.
So $1,500 a month, if you're already struggling, you're not going to be able to afford a place like that. So one of the things we're doing at the mission, I didn't talk about it before, is we're looking at more long-term housing. We have a graduate program that we already have, that people that go through our program, we have housing that they can be in for 2 to 3 years, maybe even longer. We help them with budgeting and making sure they have their license and a car and a good job. And so that's, the mission's free up until that point. But once they start getting our graduate program, we charge just a small rent. It's like $250 to $350, somewhere in there. And that's really to get them used to starting to pay that back again. Because, when you leave, when you're at the mission for a year and a half, we take care of all your needs. Well, you got to get used to that cycle again of saying, hey, monthly payment, I've got to make sure I pay this. It's got to be one of my first payments, or I'm not going to have a place to stay. So one of the things we have behind the mission, there's a lot of Section 8 housing. We bought one of the apartment complexes so far. We'd like to buy most of them at some point. We'd like to come through and buy those and have it where we can even have folks that maybe don't go through the program that could have that availability to them. So that's some of the things. We're also looking at a SRO program, which is a single room occupancy. and where it's you rent a room and then there's like common cooking areas and things like that. We're looking maybe to build that in the next couple of years. We'd like to do about a 60 bedroom facility. We have about 3 acres just on the back of our campus that we would like to possibly do that. We're still in the not public phase. We're talking about it a little bit, but we're doing the analysis to make sure we can fund it and make sure we have the money to build it.
Okay, I have so many questions. This is very exciting. I'm glad you brought this up. So the first is, I noticed in your previous interview that you'd said you filled up, you built a separate wing and filled it up like within 6 months. So what does the waiting list look like for a shelter bed?
In our area, I would say that the mission will take, we don't want anybody to be on the street, so we will put a mat on the floor even if that's the case. So in the hardest times of winter and the hottest times of the summer, we're going to make sure that people aren't staying on the street. So there's availability for people to come. We're pretty full, and what I mean that is that our rooms and our bunk beds are full, but we're going to get some mats and make sure somebody has a place to stay. There are some that are homeless in Huntsville that can't come to like our mission or even Salvation Army or some of those because they have charge of sexual misconduct on their from their charge. And so for us, because we have kids and moms that stay with us, we can't, but we're looking at doing something even with that. We're maybe going to open something out in the county, like a farm or something like that, where maybe we could take some of those, because they were clearing some of the tent cities that we had, and some of the guys were saying, well, hey, go to the mission. And they would say, well, I can't because I have this on my record. We wish our campus could take them, but we can't because of how we're not going to cause safety issues for the moms and kids. And so we're looking to do that as well. Maybe some kind of farm or, some kind of, like I said, out in the county and this, where it's more rural, of having something where we could have folks like that stay.
Awesome. And so for I would call sounds like your building is permanent supportive housing, or like fairly permanent supportive housing. Mm-hmm. Yeah, like are these apartments, or like what kind of housing is it?
So we have some rooms at the mission that are for Graduate Hall, but we also have that apartment complex. It's a fourplex. And so we have 2 men. That's a men's facility. Then we have a house on the back of our campus. We have about 7 women that stay there. And then, like I said, we're hoping to buy some of those that are directly behind us. They're all fourplexes, and if we could buy 6 or 8 of them, we definitely would like to almost put a fence around them and make them part of our campus. And so that's one of the goals for us. And then that SRO unit that I talked about, we're hoping to have that in the next 5 years.
And you're going to build the SRO?
Yeah, we'll do that ground up.
And have you gone through permitting?
Not yet, no. We have not.
Come back to me.
Yeah.
No, I'm a huge fan of SROs. I found out what an SRO was when I was living in San Francisco.
What are SROs? That would be a good thing to cover.
Thank you. So basically, it stands for single room occupancy. And so what it means is you get a room, and depending on how they're set up, you're either sharing a bathroom, a kitchen, or both. And it's usually like per floor. So every floor will have its own. It's basically like adult dorms.
That makes sense.
Yeah. So like a lot of people would be like single men who would come to San Francisco, work for a few months or a season, and then go somewhere else. Like, you don't want to rent a whole apartment. You don't need a whole apartment. There's a concept in housing that we need to legalize the lowest rungs of the housing ladder. Right now, we have tents and then the kind of housing that it's legal to build. And in cities like San Francisco, they actually demolished their SROs because the people who lived near them thought they were unsightly and didn't like the kind of tenant that it attracted, and didn't replace them with equally affordable housing, if you'll believe that. So it obviously exacerbated the homelessness crisis by a lot. So yeah.
Literally took units out of a scarce market already.
Correct. Yeah. Yeah, and SROs, it's a very efficient way to live. It's a very environmentally friendly way to live. It's a very community-oriented way to live. Like, there's absolutely nothing wrong with SROs except that they're associated with lower incomes. And a little bit of transience, more transience than like, somebody who owns a single family home. But an economy needs mobile labor, so that's not a bad thing either. Yeah. Anyway, I'm a huge fan of SROs. Those kinds of projects will often have trouble getting built for the same reason cities removed them. Mm-hmm. But all the luck in the world getting that through.
Well, have you heard of Community of Hope? There's a group here locally called Community of Hope, and
they're modeled on the Texas thing, their permanent supportive housing.
Yeah, they're trying to do small, tiny homes. Well, they ran into the same thing with the city, where square footage wise, I think they were trying to do 300 or 400 square feet per tiny home, and they were going to have a whole community, which is great. I was all for it. I even wanted to partner with them to see if, but I at least endorsed them. I said, listen, we'd love to see something like that, and then they're having to push it more out to the county, which then you lose the bus traffic and the things that some of those folks need. A lot of times when they get housing, that's great, but then how am I going to get to my job? Right. That's why there's bus routes, and that's why they probably need to be more towards the city. But then the city doesn't want them because they're not paying the high taxes like they can get on these apartment complexes, so they push them back out. So
that is interesting. I did not know that. I did see the website, and I just saw that there hadn't been a lot of posts recently. There was like a flurry of activity in 2020, and then there wasn't a lot, so I didn't know that they'd run into. So they are on track to build, but they are going to do it in the county.
Yeah, I know they've raised some money, and I'm very supportive of them. I'm hoping that they can, if they can get the tract of land that they're wanting to get in the county, and then they're trying to work with I know they're trying to work with the city to have a bus route out there. If they can do that, then I think it'd be a slam dunk. I really do. I think it'd be a great thing for the city to have something like that.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that it's really, the more that I'm reading about homelessness, and I've been working on housing for many years. It's something I focused on. I wrote about when I lived in San Francisco. But it's a supply issue, right? You cannot solve homelessness without more homes. Yeah. And you cannot build more homes if it's not profitable to do so. Mm-hmm. And it's not going to be profitable to do so if it's only legal to build any multifamily on, 15% of Huntsville?
For when we checked it last, it was between 15 to 20% of Huntsville was zoned for R2 or an area that was... There were a couple of exceptions that allowed multifamily, but all in all, it came out to about a max of 20%. Most of it's single family, then you have retail, all the commercial zones, all that. But
yeah,
overwhelming, yeah. In terms of percentage of single family versus multifamily, astronomically higher.
I just proposed to my board some things for our 5-year plan, and it's about doing some more building and trying to expand. We have a women's facility that I mentioned before that, 6 months after it was built, it was full. So we're trying to expand that. We're expanding some of our programs, but a big part of it is our extended housing as well. And, I know I was at 3 different cities that I've worked in rescue, and Huntsville's getting to be big, and along with that comes, if there's a promise of a job, and there's a lot of jobs here right now, but not everybody gets the job, and then they kind of get stuck here, and so we're preparing as a ministry to try to meet some of those needs, because I know in the next 5 years, with the way this is growing here, that we're going to have more facilities available because there's going to be more people coming. But I think that the city has to understand that that's going to be something that comes along with the growth. Now, you can grow all the rich homes that you want, you can grow all the nice apartments that you want, but you're going to have some that are needy that'll need some help too. And that just comes with the growth of a city. And so we're trying on our side to make sure we're planning for that.
That's great. And I think that one of the things that we are trying to do here is anytime you want to propose new affordable housing, and by affordable, I just mean, yeah, anything below market rate, certainly. But even a lot of market rate housing, new market rate housing, there's going to be a group that is going to be opposed to it. Not in my backyard, right? And so we're trying to create a coalition of local people who are going to represent, it's what do they call it? Like, it's a special interest problem, right? Everyone, anytime new housing doesn't happen or becomes more expensive artificially, everyone suffers a little bit. Some people suffer a lot, the people who lose their housing, for example. But we all suffer from a situation in which housing is more expensive and more people are homeless. But those people who are going to live near the new housing, they are motivated to show up. And I just want to create a coalition of people who are motivated to advocate on the other side and say, like, no, we need this new housing because every unit of market rate housing brings the cost of market rate housing down. And, I agree that there, even in a perfect marketplace where, for every new person who moved to Huntsville, a new apartment popped up immediately to house them and the housing prices stayed stable, there are still going to be people who are going to need help. But how much more expensive is it to house them when the market rate for housing is exorbitantly expensive?
Yeah.
So, anyway, not to tip our hand too much, but that's something that we're going to be focused on is like, and I also wanted to talk to you about, I think people will see homeless people in physical and mental distress and attribute homelessness to physical and mental illness, for example. But what I think a lot of people miss, and what I didn't realize until I started looking into it, is how deleterious homelessness itself is to a person's mental and physical health. Especially if they're unsheltered, it's a constant state of hypervigilance. You're not safe. Your belongings aren't safe. There's sleeplessness, right? There's heat exposure, insect bites. Like, it's just so many. Just the constant stress of homelessness, affects people so negatively. And I just wanted to hear your perspective on what you've seen in terms of the, how homelessness is so harmful to the people who are enduring it, and how these individuals are never going to get better until they're housed.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that we have a board member that's a dermatologist, and he comes, I think it's 3-4 times a month. People don't think, like, if you're out in the elements all the time, your skin's going to be, exposed to sun. And so we love that he comes down because he does scans of everybody and makes sure that how they're doing. Another thing is teeth. That's a big, so one of the things we're hoping to do in the future is have a dental part of our, we have a med wing that we have that we somewhat partner with Huntsville Hospital on. Their med bus comes and they use our facilities really for the community to come in if they want. But yeah, the teeth is a major issue. When you're out and about, you're probably not thinking, I need to take care of my teeth. So a lot of the homeless have major issues with their teeth. And then the skin cancer is really bad. So I love that we have that program because a lot of folks are getting checked. On the mental side, yeah. I mean, when you have your whole existence is every second, every minute, every hour of every day, all you're thinking about is how do I exist? There's no rest from that. You become a weary soul, and that hurts your mental psyche for sure.
Well, and sorry.
I was going to say, I never would have thought about like the value of having a dermatologist, dentist to some degree, but yeah, I never thought about the effects of being outside without any of your skin. But I mean, those in their own way cause a decent bit of mental anguish, especially if you start having nerve pains like in your mouth all the time. Sure. That is maddening pain by itself that will stop you from doing anything productive.
Yeah.
Well, and it's so systemic. So yeah, when you don't take care of your teeth, you're at increased risk for heart disease and, all these other things. It's all connected.
Yeah, there's a lot of diabetes out there with homeless. There's heart issues. I mean,
Attention.
Yep.
Yeah, that's the other thing I wanted to talk to you about. What I think a lot of people don't understand is an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure from a pure financial perspective. Homelessness is really expensive. So as much as it might cost Huntsville to house every homeless person, we're going to save money in the end. And I'm going to list off some of the expenses that I've been thinking about, but like the dermatologist, I'm sure you'll have others, but emergency services, police intervention, what it costs the city to treat someone's mental illness and addiction, which again, both get worse the longer someone's homeless. Diabetes is more prevalent among the homeless population. Diabetes is an extremely expensive condition to treat. It lasts for decades. So, you got somebody who's homeless for 1 year, maybe they get diabetes a year sooner or 10 years sooner, right? And that's an extra decade of, very expensive condition. Then there's just the, other public health issues where, you've got greater levels of like Hep A, other communicable diseases. And then there's just what the economy isn't getting from these people if they had stable housing, which would open up opportunities for them to volunteer and work and, be more productive parts of the community. And so I think that if people understood how these costs are kind of diffuse, but they're large. And, besides the fact that it's like the right thing to do to house homeless people, it's also cost effective. What are some other costs that you think about when you think about what it costs the city, the state, society to, and before I let you answer, something that I talked about in the first video that I made about why we're doing this project is, when I lived in San Francisco, the homeless situation, homelessness was so intense and so prevalent that you had to become inured to it to survive. I remember when I was walking down the street, and I'm sorry for people who've heard this, but I was new to San Francisco, and the man was laid out with blood coming out of his head on the sidewalk. And so I called the cops. I didn't know what else to do. It's what I would have done in any other city. And I had to get going, so I left. But by the time I got to where I was going, I realized if I stopped and called the cops for every person who was bleeding on the sidewalk, I would never get anywhere. And I realized if I were ever bleeding on the sidewalk, no one would stop for me either, because I would just be part of the landscape, because that's what it is there. And it's dehumanizing. I'm dehumanizing these people. They're dehumanizing me in that I'm not there dehumanizing me, but I'm becoming less human the less empathy I have for my fellow humans. And that's just something I don't want to see happen to Huntsville. And it will if we don't start building housing and creating infrastructure and implementing programs that work. If housing prices just keep rising and the infrastructure stays the same, otherwise we're going to have more homelessness, and it's going to be something that we just tolerate.
Yeah.
And I don't want that to happen. Anyway, so some of the costs of homelessness.
Yeah, I've talked to Huntsville Hospital at length, and on a cold night or a hot night, sometimes folks will go there just to get shelter. And so they still have to, check their blood pressure, admit them, all those things, because they go to the emergency room. And they said the cost is thousands and thousands of dollars just to have them come in, and they're not payees, right? They're not going to pay. And so I know that they're really interested in working with us about doing some expanding of our, like a community health center kind of thing. And I know that it's a weight on the police force too, because they're, having to go out and about and try to find out, this call for this guy over here, this person's in front of a storefront, and you've been out in California, but there's a mass problem out there. I mean, I was in San Diego just last year, and middle class neighborhoods have tents going right down the middle of the section, and it's something that I think people need to start being awake to. I think the government. I said this in another podcast that during the 80s they really kind of just let loose of the mental health facilities that were there, and there's 40% of the people that we work with in Huntsville have some kind of major mental illness, and so they might not be able to just get a house either, right? So what are we going to do for them? Are we going to find something that we can have some kind of a case management, or we're doing that at the mission, but beyond that, what is the community going to be able to do to say, hey, listen, where is a place for them to be that could be sustainable for them? They might not be able to hold a job, or because their mental illness keeps them from that, or maybe they can do a job, but it's not enough to pay for an apartment. How do we figure that out as a group? And I think that's something that the Huntsville community really needs to start thinking about.
Couldn't agree more. Definitely. And when I was in San Francisco, I remember hearing about the concept of conservatorship, and I was like, I don't like that. But living in San Francisco gave me a crash course in why it's necessary. And so, it just seemed to me like there's no real, you get to a point where your compassion ends up being callousness. And I think that in San Francisco, there was this group of people who would advocate, like, no, like, every person should be sovereign and they should be able to decide, where they're going to sleep and whether they're going to take their medicine. And it's like, that sounds good, but when you are in a situation in which your incapacity is so great that you're literally just deteriorating on the streets, that's not caring anymore. And I think that it is going to be the right thing to do and especially like once we are in a situation where people are not homeless simply because housing has gotten too expensive, right? When we get the cost of housing down and we legalize some of the more affordable forms of housing, there will be a percentage of the population, a small percentage, who is not in a place where they can make choices on their own behalf about, again, whether to take their medicine, where to sleep, whether to go to the doctor, things like that. So we need to appoint conservators. We need to say this person is responsible for this person, for making sure that they're like safe and cared for.
Yep.
I don't think there's any way around it.
Yeah. I've been around this long enough to know that there are some folks that they can't even help themselves. They have no idea that they need to take that, pain med or the, diabetic med or whatever they might be. Yeah. And what are they going to do? I mean, they're stuck because, hey, we'll throw medicine at you, but I don't even know how to take this. I mean, we've had some mentally ill folks that have just, one day they seem fine, the next day they're not. If somebody could be looking over them, boy, it would be helpful, because they can't do it on their own. Or if there's a group home or just something, that there could be a place that somebody is saying, we need to make sure we take care of those folks. And like I said, in the 80s, they just kind of mainstreamed everybody and put them out in the street. Well, what that did is it pushed most of them into shelters. And so who's going to take care of them? Well, a lot of people don't want to take care of that guy talking to himself in the stop sign down in the corner. It's going to be a rescue mission that says, hey, we'll take care of them. And that's what's happened over the last 30 years, is it's really been rescue missions that have picked up the buck for it,
And prisons and jails.
Yeah, true. That's true too, yeah.
Yeah. We definitely need, long-term care facilities. That was a huge mistake. There's always going to be a percentage of the population that's going to need that kind of help.
Yeah.
But yeah, and then I was curious about the mobility aspect So California statewide study of people experiencing homelessness. This is the largest study of homelessness since the 90s. Recently found that 22% of their participants had limited mobility and 20% used a mobility aid, such as a cane, crutches, walker, wheelchair. That's 1/3 among people 50 and older. Is DRM wheelchair and walker accessible?
It is.
Awesome. And then I was curious about, like, are there any limits on, like, can someone who's on oxygen sleep there? Are there any limits on what medications people can be taking when they are sleeping there?
We do have some limitations with some of the how would I say it? There's some drugs that almost become a black market, and we really have to watch those. Some of our pain meds and things like that. So we help take care of the folks, but we can't monitor them. Hey, I put that in my mouth. Well, I can sell it for $10 instead.
Right.
So we have to cut off some. Oxygen's really hard for us because we had a guy when we were at our old location that thought he would sneak a smoke when he was on oxygen and started about half the place on fire because he did that. So there's an issue with safety there. Our goal is that we want to be safe for everybody. So there's some rules that we have to do to make sure that the ones that are there, it only touches a couple. Now, there's extreme cases. We've had folks, one of the things, we have a written document we have with Huntsville Hospital that they don't release anybody that, is incontinent or anything. We can't be helping folk, they actually need a nurse aid at all times. So those kind of situations we try to work out with the hospital and say, listen, we're not adapt to take care of those folks. Same thing with some of the ones that are on certain kinds of drugs. Well, listen, we can't take those folks right now. Now, we'll take anybody. We don't want anybody dying, but some of those drugs, we got to watch out that it doesn't get to be a black market at the mission, because we don't want them smoking marijuana on our campus or taking any hardcore drugs. I mean, that's part of what our goal is not having them do that.
Yeah, absolutely. Are there any shelters how many shelters are operating in Huntsville?
There's a couple small ones, and then there's Salvation Army, and then there's us.
Okay, so like 4.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And do any of them accept people who are not clean and sober?
We do.
Okay.
Yep.
But they can't have drugs on them?
Yeah, you can be drunk, you can be stoned, but you can't have the drugs on you yet.
Okay. And then I was curious about if someone is trans, for example, like, how do you handle, like, are they accepted? Which form do they go to?
We've had some come through the years, and what we have is we have a special place. It's hard for us to put them with the moms and kids, and so and most of the times it's a man transitioning to be a woman, so they still have their parts, and we don't put them where it could hurt somebody else. So we have a special place that we put them. We have a dorm set aside that we've had for them when they come. And every time we've had somebody, we had one probably about 2 years ago come through. They were happy with the situation. They were there about 10 days, and then they moved to wherever their family was, I think they were going to.
And you didn't try to separate them from their medication? Or?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Great. And then and you've said many times you accept people of any religion.
Mm-hmm.
I guess if a resident doesn't want to enter into you called it a program, the 1 year.
Yep.
How long are they allowed to stay, or how does that work?
Well, one of the fallacies that people have about the mission, it's really a false narrative, is that the mission just feeds people and then they push them out to the street during the day. Now, we have our campus set up where there's day rooms, and then there's also courtyards they can smoke, or make sure that we're a non-smoking facility, but that we have a place where they can go smoke on our campus. We do not tell them to come or go. They're allowed to stay on the campus 24 hours a day. They can stay there and eat 3 meals a day, or if they want to come in the morning, just have breakfast and then come back for dinner and then sleep the night, that's fine. Because some of them go and actually have jobs. Some of the people that stay in our overnight facilities go out and have a job, and then they come back and they have the meal at night, and then they sleep up, and the next day they go to their job again. So yeah, unless somebody is causing major harm to somebody, they're allowed to stay on our campus. We do have a few people that have been banned from the mission, and those are people that have caused physical harm to somebody else. That's the only, and that's really for the safety of the majority of the people there. That's the only people that aren't allowed to come on our campus.
That makes sense. I'm just wondering, like, if like a practicing Muslim came and they said, I want to stay, or nobody probably wants to stay, but I need to stay 3 months, for example, but I can't participate in any of the faith-based activities. Like, is that acceptable?
We've had it happen. We do a Bible study at lunch. If they want to listen, they can listen. If they don't have to. But they're allowed to come. We've had Muslims there before, and, they've been happy with, hey, thank you for giving me the food and shelter while I've been here. And we'll ask them, do you want to get in our program? No, I don't want to get in a faith-based program that's, Christian-based. And so that's okay. They can stay in our emergency shelter.
Awesome. And then one thing that's really, so I've been doing research about, like, why people often can't stay in a shelter. So, for example, they don't want, they're on oxygen, for example, or maybe would choose not to, like, say they don't want to be separated from their spouse or a pet. But I was also looking at some people have their belongings lost or stolen when they enter into shelters. And I was just wondering if you guys had any.
So we have a 25-pound weight limit. So when somebody comes in, they get a bin and it's weighed, and then they have the bin is taken and put in a locker, and their locker 103. And so when you leave, you say, I've got my token 103. You get your stuff, and whatever you want to take out of it, you can. So for us, we take care of it, manage it in one of our dorms. When you walk in, there's a facility where you see, just these bins stacked one on top of another. They're numbered on the wall, and that's how they get their goods. Usually, we've not had any issues with it that way. Before we did that, they would have their own lockers, and that was always somebody saying, "Hey, somebody stole my sneakers or my shoes or whatever." But we've not had much issue since then. There's some that say, "Hey, I came in with this," and then they say, "Oh, well, oh yeah, I did find it in my pocket," but most of the times we've had no issue since we've done the bin system.
That's great. Yeah, because it can be so detrimental. These people get their mobility aids stolen, their medication stolen, their ID stolen, and if you don't have state issued ID, you can't stay at the shelter, for example. So that's great.
And if they come, like if they have, we give them three pairs of jeans or pants, shirts and stuff. And if they want to come back, they can get that the next time. So if they come in, they got, you see some folks that are homeless and they got the ragged old jeans on and they're dirty. They come in and they're more than welcome to exchange them. Or we also have a wash service that every other day, all the clothes from the guys that are in our men's facility and the women on their side, they're able to clean their clothes. So actually, they don't clean them. We clean them for them. We have these big industrial cleaners that wash machine and dryer that we clean their clothes. And then also all their, the blankets and sheets and stuff, they're done every day. So we have a 24-hour, if you ever come tour, we have a laundry system that 24 hours a day it's running because we are taking care of everybody's laundry all the time. It's almost like a hotel because we're doing the linens and stuff too. And then we do all their clothes too.
That's awesome. That's wonderful. So if someone qualifies for your shelter, obviously if they are homeless or are at risk of becoming homeless, should they just show up? Like, do you have any transportation services? Do you help arrange transportation? Like, how does that work?
We're known as an open door mission, means that our doors are always open. We don't always go out though.
Okay.
So we've had people where they come in a cop car to be dropped off. We've had family drop people off. The bus, they get off. There's a bus stop right on the corner of the mission's property. So they get off and they are able to come right in. And there's no eligibility, they're able to come as long as they have a issued ID. And that, again, if we didn't have a women's facility on our campus, we probably wouldn't have that rule, but we have to ID everybody to make sure they're not on the list for the sexual crime. So that's a safety issue for us. So, and we'll even take a police officer's IDing the person if they're come and they're with a police officer and he says he doesn't have ID, but the police officer can verify his ID and we can check that ID through that. We're okay with that as well.
Awesome. And then what would you recommend someone do if they don't? Is there anything else available for people who find themselves unhoused and don't qualify for shelter?
In what area are you talking about? Like a shelter?
So like, okay, I live in Huntsville. I'm a registered sex offender, let's say.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not, but let's say I am. Obviously I don't qualify for shelter. Is there anything else available to me?
For the sex offenders, there's not, and that's why the mission's looking at some other avenues for that, where we can do it, where, we're going to make sure the 1,000-foot rule and all those things pertain. We're talking about maybe a working farm at some point where we could have them come out and be part of that. Here's my thing, and this is the religious side for me, is those people need Jesus too. So I see those as brothers and sisters. Yes, they've had some bad crimes in their past. But I also saw a young man get accused of a crime who was dating a 16-year-old girl, and he was 17, and the dad wasn't happy that they had sex, so he called out the kid. They're now married, and he still has a sex crime on his record the rest of his life because the dad called him out. Because she was 16 and he was 17. She was underage, so that was the problem. And so, that's not every situation. I know there's some folks that have some bad things on their record too, but there's some folks out there that don't have that. And I mean, that's a tough situation when you have that happen.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is out of the purview of this, but it's actually a huge factor in homelessness is if you're on the sex offender registry, you're not allowed to live in most cities because most cities is near a school or a playground or somewhere you're not allowed to be.
Yep.
So if you're low income and a sex offender, your options for housing may be a tent because there may literally not be affordable housing where you're legally allowed to live. That happens a lot. And
here's the problem that people don't realize is those tents can go anywhere. Like,
oh yeah.
So
totally.
You would rather know that they're at a good place than staying somewhere where you're not sure where they are,
You would think you would, and this is the problem with the sex offender registry is it is so broad. So many urinating in public can get you put on the sex offender registry. Mm-hmm. Receiving a lewd from your 16-year-old girlfriend that you didn't even ask for can land you on the sex offender registry. Yeah. People who are in no way, shape, or form threats to society are on the sex offender registry, which means if I get an alert that someone is moving in, I don't know whether to be scared or just like, ugh.
Yeah, it's very broad.
You don't want something that has that much of an impact on your life to have that much gray area and vary. Because that'll effectively end a lot of your life.
In Louisiana, being trans and a sex worker will get you put on the sex offender registry.
Wow.
Now, how is my safety threatened by a trans sex worker? Like, it's absurd. And again, like, these are primarily sex workers of color, the most marginalized of the marginalized, and now we're going to make it difficult for them to rent apartments and hold jobs and be where they need to be in life.
And really, our tent cities have become I think that when there was 100 of them at the one place, I think they said there's 60% of them when they were trying to move them out. They're like, where do we go? Because we can't go to the shelters. And we were there helping the city say, hey, come to the mission. But once they said, hey, I have a sex offender crime, where do we send them? So it's difficult. And that's why we're trying to figure out what we can do in the future to help those folks. Because I don't want to see them on the street either. I think it's safer for our community if they're not on the street. and it's definitely safer for them. And then there's all those illustrations that you mentioned that say, hey, some of these folks aren't even, it's such a wide swath that we say, hey, you're a sex offender, because everybody right away goes, well, that's a child molester there, and a lot of times it's not. So there's not really different grades, when they do it with that. Once you're on the registry, you're on the registry.
And the fact that it's for life.
Yep.
There's all kinds of problems with it. But yeah, I guess, how would you suggest people who care about this issue, what would you suggest that they do? What would be most helpful?
With the sex offender?
No, sorry, homelessness.
With the homelessness, I think like you guys are talking, let's be active trying to help. A lot of folks say, well, we've got a rescue mission, and sure, we appreciate the donations and stuff, but boy, we'd rather have volunteers come down and help us, because once they see what's going on down there and they're helping folks, or, First Stop, which goes out to the woods and helps the folks that are in the woods, man, go and volunteer there. See what you can do as a neighbor, because they're really your neighbors. Even if they're in a tent, they're still your neighbor. Even if they're at the mission, they're still your neighbor. Go and volunteer and find out, hey, how can I help these people better? And maybe there's things we can do with, our city, and say, hey, we get a group of people together to say, man, we need some more affordable housing. I would cautionary tale to that. I've been part of the Housing First group for a while, and the government was really pushing that on shelters for a while, and we found that it doesn't always work. It works sometimes, but some folks need structure before they get into the house. And that's why we're finding that our program, it's 74% success rate, that once they go through our program, they don't become homeless again 5-6 years out. That's what we want. We don't want them to become homeless again. So then they're getting their house, then they're getting their car. And then the 25% or so that they usually come back through our program again, and they're successful the second time or the third time, because we'll let them go through as many times as they need. But I do think housing is a major thing. So, but you got to watch, because there's some folks that can handle that amount of pressure in their life, and there's some folks that can't. And so I always advise, hey, some folks need to go through a program. If you set up a mom and kids with a house, they may be fine to go. She can go out and find a job and make sure the kids are in school, but there's some folks that really need to go through a program before they are able to settle down into a house situation.
Yeah, that makes sense. One thing that I think really makes me optimistic about working on this issue in Huntsville, especially in comparison to San Francisco, is I read once, and this seems true to my experience, that people on the more right end of the political spectrum, they tend to give more locally and directly, and people on the left tend to give more like nationally, and they tend to want to do it through like a government apparatus. And I think that, probably you're going to need both, but being in San Francisco, where it was so on the government end, and seeing all the red tape and all the waste of that alone, I think there's so much opportunity for, this is a local problem. And I think there's something very human and satisfying about an individual looking around at their geographic surroundings and finding the people who they share a community with that need their help, and like working with those people directly, versus, I think both are good. I think it's good to think globally, but act locally often when you can. And so I totally agree that like showing up and getting involved is going to be great.
I find usually that if they give locally and they volunteer locally, that's where the most impact's going to happen. Yeah, nationally is fine. I mean, giving nationally to some things, but if they're able to put their money to it, that's great. But if they're able to put their money and the volunteerism together, boy, there's a lot of things that could be accomplished, because I think the neighbors are actually finding out what the other neighbors can do, you know?
Totally. Yeah. I think is there anything else you'd want our audience to know? Or
There's nothing that I can think of. I'm trying, but I'm just drawing blanks.
I would just say if somebody is in need of help, whether they're homeless or if they're just needing food, we have a whole food bag program that we do where people, if they're still in their homes, but they're just, paycheck to paycheck, come on down. We'll help you out with some food. And if you're homeless and you see this, come on down to the mission. We'll help take care of you.
Wonderful. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you for inviting me.